So with that said, even with variations in legislative requirements across Canada, there are many common elements that we'll see in the legislation as they relate to workplace violence prevention programs. So generally, workplace violence prevention programs from a legal context must contain certain elements, and I have some of them written here for you on the screen. And I won't go over all the elements, but I'll touch on a few. So for example, a common element in violence prevention programs is actually defining violence. So every jurisdiction in Canada does have their own definition of workplace violence and what it means. And most will contain some common language, like references to something like a threat. So for example, if you live in Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia's legislation defines workplace violence as threats, including a threatening statement or threatening behavior that gives an employee a reasonable cause to believe that that employee is at risk of physical injury. In Alberta, violence has a slightly different definition, and in Alberta, it's the threatened, attempted, or actual conduct of a person that causes or is likely to cause physical or psychological injury or harm, and also includes domestic or sexual violence. So violence can really include any act where someone is abused or threatened or assaulted. And some examples might include things like shaking your fist in front of somebody or vandalizing property, destroying someone's belongings, pulling pranks on people, physically assaulting people, or even uttering threats like, I'll make you pay for what you did. So there are, unfortunately, many different types of workplace violence. And when you're thinking about a prevention program and when you're thinking about your lone workers and how it relates to workplace violence, really consider all forms of workplace violence and what that would look like in your specific workplace. Now that's the definition. Another common element that you'll see in workplace violence prevention legislation is reference to a workplace assessment. So essentially, employers have to identify situations that put workers at risk of violence and conduct a site-specific risk assessment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on when it comes to risk assessments. Another common element would be developing preventative measures or control measures. So this means once you conduct your risk assessment, you assign or implement control measures in an effort to mitigate the risk of violence. And again, we'll look at some specific definitions of control measures a little bit later on. Developing a workplace violence policy in a program is also a common element that you'll see across jurisdictions. And this policy and program can include things like how you're going to control the risk, how you're going to report incidents of workplace violence, how you're going to get immediate assistance in case it's needed, and how employers are going to conduct investigations. The last point I'll touch on here is education and training. So all workers in a workplace should be aware that the employer has a violence policy and program, and they should be aware of where to find it. And ultimately, workers should know how to summon emergency assistance in case it's needed. They should know how to report incidents of workplace violence. They should know how their employer is going to deal with incidents of workplace violence. And they also have to ensure that they know their own roles and responsibilities and how to carry out the control measures that are put in place to prevent violence in the workplace.